There are several ways to solve quadratic equations. The first one we're going to talk about is solving by factoring. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this quadratic, which is a trinomial, and we're going to factor it into two binomials and set both binomials, each binomial, to 0. In order to do that, we have to do a couple of things to this particular equation in example number 1 so that we can prepare to factor. The first step that we have to do is we have to set our quadratic to 0. And if you can see, we have this quadratic equals x minus 5. So I've got to get rid of this x minus 5, bring it over to the other side so that the quadratic equals 0. I'm going to do this in one step. I'm going to subtract this whole thing, right? I'm going to subtract x minus 5 from both sides. So that's going to be 0 over here because I'm subtracting it from itself. And then over here, I'm going to subtract x. And then I'm going to subtract negative 5, which is the same as adding 5. So what do I end up with? I have x squared minus 10x plus 24 is going to equal 0. Now, what I have to do is I've got to factor this trinomial into two binomials, which when multiplied together are going to give me 0. Now, since the leading coefficient is 1, all I have to do is put an x in each binomial because x times x is going to give me x squared. And now I'm going to look at the constant. The constant is positive, and because it's positive, I know that I have to multiply two positive numbers. So, what are my factors of 24? What can I multiply together to give me 24? Well, I could do 1 times 24. I could do 2 times 12. I could do 3 times 8. And I could do 4 times 6. Okay, so let's look. How am I going to pick which one to use? Well, I'm going to look at my x term over here. And it says minus 10x. That means first of all that the two numbers I'm going to multiply to get 24 are going to have to be negative, because two negatives multiplied together is going to give me a positive, but this middle term here, the negative 10x, I have to get that by adding these two factors together. So over here, when I look, which of these two factors do I multiply together to get 24 and add together to get an absolute value of 10? Well, that would be 4 times 6. So I'm going to put a 4 here, and I'm going to put a 6 here. Now, let's deal with this negative thing. So my middle term is negative 10, and again, both of these numbers have to be negative because they're going to multiply together to give me positive 24. So I'm going to put negative. Now, let me check. X times x is going to be x squared. X times 6, negative 6 is negative 6x plus a negative 4x. Okay, so that looks good to me. Now, I'm going to set each of these to 0. So, I'm going to have x minus 4 equals 0. And I'm going to have x minus 6 equals 0. Okay, now let's isolate x. oops, let's get rid of that. I'm going to isolate x by adding 4 over here, and that's going to give me x equals 4. And over here, I'm going to isolate x by adding 6 to both sides. And this is going to give me x equals 6. So the solution to my quadratic is going to be 4 and 6. Okay, now that's the first kind of trinomial that we're going to do. Now, the second one is a special case. First thing, again, we're going to set our quadratic to 0, so I have to subtract 4 from both sides. Okay, and this is going to be 0. And I'm going to have x squared minus 49 equals 0. Now, if you look here, there are only 2 terms here. This is not a trinomial, this is a binomial, but it's a specific kind of binomial. It's what we call the difference of 2 squares, because x squared is a square, it's x times x, and 49 is 7 times 7, and this subtraction is the difference in our difference of squares. Okay, so all that means is that we are subtracting the square of one number from the square of another. When you have the difference of squares, factoring is kind of easy. Okay, so all you have to do first of all is recognize that it's a difference of squares. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put our x here. And since I know that a positive times a negative is going to give me a negative, and I know that 7 times 7 is 49, my factors have to be x plus 7 and x minus 7. Okay, now let's see what we have here. Let's set x plus 7 to be equal to 0 and x minus 7 be equal to 0. Now, if you have a little number sense, you can tell right away what our solutions are going to be. Our solutions are going to actually be negative 7 and 7, and here's why. So, to isolate the variable here, I have to subtract 7, and so x is going to be negative 7, and here I'm going to have to add 7. This is going to cancel out, and x is going to be equal to positive 7. So whenever we have the difference of squares, our solution set is going to be the same absolute value. One will be positive and one will be negative. And those are 2 examples of factoring to solve quadratic equations.